existence of that propaganda plays a role in getting people to engage in terrorism, then there's a connection. Notice, though, that what matters is the existence of some number of awful things that can be used to justify a policy. It's not sensitive or not that sensitive to the number that have happened. Right? And this is just like if you think about the current debate about immigration on the southern border of the United States. Right? The thing that is critical for the president's rhetorical strategy to get support for the wall is not the actual intensity of harm caused to American citizens by illegal immigrants. It's the existence of one or two awful examples. And that's enough to generate the speeches and the ads and things. And the same is true for violent organizations. The fact that once or twice or three times or a dozen times the government has made mistakes with tragic consequence is enough for them to generate the propaganda that they need to try and motivate participation in terrorism.
When you compare symmetric conflict versus asymmetric conflict, I tend to think of the Second World War as a symmetric conflict and recent insurgencies in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places as asymmetric ones. And I always wonder how the citizens of Germany and Japan warmed up to the United States right after the Second World War. You look at the nuke bombings of Japan, you look at the fire bombings of Dresden, Hamburg, and several other German cities, sometimes done with the explicit intent to kill civilians. And despite all of that, there seems to be no animosity between the citizens of these countries and the US. But in case of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places in the Middle East, despite the massive amounts of money that has been pumped into reconstruction and definitely more effort into reducing civilian casualties, there seems to be huge animosity between the people of these two countries. Why do you think this is the case? Is it religion? Is it regional geopolitics? Is it culture?
So I don't know for sure, but my guess would be it has something to do with the intensity of the war experience. As tragic as the war experience of the Iraqi people was in 2003 and during the civil war between 2004 and 2008, it was a pale shadow at best on the experience of the German people during World War II.
That's what I think, yeah.
And so, or the Japanese people. And so, the level of trauma that was suffered by those populations in those wars is just impossible for us to conceive. And so, when we think about the reaction in these conflicts, the experience of the society was just completely different. Those were societies where, basically the vast majority of the men between age 18 and 40 were killed or injured in the conflict. Like, no one in either of those countries, almost no one, lacked family members, friends, close relatives who had died. They all suffered massive deprivation in terms of the amount of food they could get, the things they could consume, their day-to-day life. Like, everything was reshaped in ways that just there's nothing approaching that intensity in the modern era, except for perhaps a few countries which have suffered what we now call, genocidal levels of violence. And so I think that just the psychology for the populations has to be completely different. But more than that rough observation, I can't say.
Hey, UC3P listeners. I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil-military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.
Moving on to some other work that you've done. Talking of President Trump's travel ban. So, as in case of civilian casualties on the battlefield, usually the opposition to the travel ban is moral and ethical. But again, you've provided some empirical reasoning behind this. Can you briefly walk us through that as well?
For sure. So the thing I thought was really terrible from a counterterrorism policy strategy about the travel ban is if you look at the ways in which terrorist plots in the West by Islamist organizations have been thwarted, it's almost always because someone inside the community in which the plotters are living decides to share information and tip off law enforcement about their presence. Mm-hmm. If the message that is sent by national policy towards Muslim populations in the United States is we as a government do not trust people of your religious beliefs and from the countries you're from, you have for sure reduced the motivation for those populations to cooperate with law enforcement. Now, whether you've done so in a big way or a small way, I don't know, but that's a really costly thing. Given the vanishingly small number of people who have actually come directly from those countries to attempt terrorist attacks in the United States, it seems crazy to me that you would have that huge, as a policy matter, you would think it was worth trading the amount of cooperation you're losing for preventing that very small number of people from coming in the country. Let me add to that. It is not just in counterterrorism policy the cooperation of the populations in the United States or Europe that matters. You also need the cooperation of people in other countries, people who are willing to come in and work as sources for the U.S. government or want to walk in and share information. And every message you send to those people that, in fact, the terrorists are right and the U.S. government does not like Muslims, that is making it harder for those case officers and intelligence professionals overseas to develop their sources. They have lots of ways to do it, and they will still be able to develop sources, but you're making their job harder in ways that are, based on all the empirical evidence, going to have very little impact on the actual risk of terrorism.
So if I'm interpreting this correctly, there are two strands of your work here.
Mm-hmm.
One is counterterrorism, which is essentially preventing attacks on US soil or Western soil. And the other is counterinsurgency, which is actually going out there in the battlefield to fight insurgents. Is that correct?
So I think of it slightly differently. I think of there being a body of work around understanding terrorist organizations and counterterror policy and how you can prevent that from happening because it's so distortive of politics. I think the other strand in my mind is thinking about what can outsiders do to help countries restore social and political order. And sometimes that comes through helping them fight insurgencies. Sometimes that comes through conducting development activities in insecure spaces. Sometimes that comes through thinking about how do you measure the political sentiment of the population around issues that are very sensitive that no one wants to talk about, but where governments need to understand why do people think certain ways. But that whole second body of work is not fundamentally about fighting insurgencies. Mm-hmm. It's fundamentally about thinking about how do you help societies restore social and political order so that they can grow and develop and people can thrive. To get to that point, the first thing you need to do is bring the violence down to an acceptable level. And so the counterinsurgency and all that research is in service of helping countries do that.
You use a lot of data for your work. I was wondering how do you gain access to this kind of data? Because you're not a reporter who actually goes out in the battlefield and you're not a military man. So how is it that you gain access to this data, or do you only work on public data?
So I only work on data that are public when I work with them. But I certainly do a lot of work to bring data out into the public sphere that would not otherwise get there. And
how do you do this?
So the way you do this is you are a partner to policy institutions. Uh-huh. You get in, you try to understand their problems, you see where your research can contribute to answering them, you take the time to get to know them and help them think through their issues. And in that process, you learn where the data which are useful reside, and you develop the relationships that let you get it out in proper ways. And what you're kind of doing there is you're engaging in kind of informal policy co-generation, right? You're getting out and providing for them what the research says about their problem. And then in exchange, they are taking the time to walk you through, here's where the data are, here's how they come from, here's the process by which they're created. And then once you go out and you work the process to get those things released, whether that's a formal declassification or just a letter from some minister saying, hey, you can use this for research, the thing is, you understand all the warts in the data. Uh-huh. And so you're not going to be misled by the fact that someone changed collection practices in this year to thinking some event happened that year, because you've taken the time to talk to people who built the data in the first place, and they will tell you in that process, here's the thing that happened in this year. So the science that you end up doing with the data is better because you took the time to get to know the people while you were in the process of getting the data out.
Do you think the insights provided by you and similar researchers, have they informed the battlefield tactics of the US Army and allied armies?
So there's tremendous variance in the battlefield tactics of the way the U.S. fights and the way its allies fight. And there is a huge community, well beyond the academic one, which is constantly looking at what's happened and thinking about how did we fight, what worked, what didn't we. And so it's hard to pin down any particular piece of influence. What I can tell you is a few things. There are for sure some commanders at some point in time who have looked at the research base that the ESOC team and others have built And so that was really useful for me in helping to think through how I fought. There are for sure development professionals who at different points in time have thought about programs or managing work in different countries who've reached out and said, man, the work that this community did and the larger development economics community that's thinking about how do you operate in insecure places, that's super helpful for us, right, and has changed how we did programming. And then if you look at the way that the U.S. government official documents talk about approaching insurgency and counterinsurgency and stabilization missions, they have for sure incorporated lessons which are consistent with what we've seen. Now, we're just like one group among many that is contributing to the research base, but the way that they talk about it and think about it has changed dramatically. So the U.S. government recently came out with this document called the Stabilization Assistance Review, which was rethinking how the U.S. government should approach stabilization missions overseas, basically the effort to help societies build political and economic stability. That document incorporates 4 or 5 things which are lessons that our research and that of others clearly demonstrate. So there is a clear transmission process that is happening by which the doctrine is moving. Now, whether that is because we went out and did the studies and people were like, okay, I believe that, or because the hard-earned experience of thousands of professionals led them to the same conclusions as we found through the econometrics, it's impossible to know, right? But for sure, things have moved in the direction that the research would suggest, right, which is extremely encouraging.
It is. I want to talk about the reasons that lead people into extremism and possibly terrorism. Okay. So there's a prevalent notion that there's a strong link between poverty and extremism. But research by you and others has shown that this is not the case. At best, this link is pretty weak. You co-authored a paper on Pakistan where you showed that the support for militant politics among the middle class is much higher than it is among the poor, especially urban poor, because they are the victims of this violence.
Exactly.
So if this link is weak, then what do you think are the main reasons that lead people into extremism?
So I don't believe in the existence of main reasons for extremism. I think if you look throughout history, there has never been a shortage of people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for political causes. And my belief is that, depending on the environment you're in, if you are the type of person who's going to be motivated by those abstract causes to participate in political violence, you have different opportunities to do that. And, Ehud Barak, former prime minister of Israel, had this line early in his career where someone asked him what he thought about people in the PLO. And he said, look, if I had been born in Nablus, I would have been in the PLO too. I was born in Israel, and so I'm in the IDF. He was an action-oriented, civically minded person who was willing to sacrifice for abstract ideals. And so he chose to produce violence on behalf of the Israeli government. Had he been born on the other side of the Green Line, he would have chosen to produce it on behalf of the various Palestinian political organizations. And so I think looking for root causes of participation in extremism is kind of a fool's errand, not because it's not interesting social science, but just because there's nothing you can do with that. Like if you show me that one cause there's one thing which is a cause and come up with a policy to shut it down, well, there are 83 other reasons that people might participate in violent extremism. And you're not going to shut those down. What I believe you need to do is create the mechanisms and capabilities for the communities from which people are being recruited to self-police. And if you look historically, the way waves of violence and extremism come down is rarely that, sometimes it's that you address the root cause, the root political cause, but more often it's because you make some progress on the root political cause and the community from which people are being recruited decides, you know what, that's no longer okay. And so we're going to tell people it's a stupid thing to do, and when we see people doing it, we're going to share that information with whoever the relevant authorities are so they can pull those people off the street. And that's the way the kind of violence ends, at least leaving aside the, genocide, mass population movements, all the horrible, really, really horrible things that have happened throughout history.
Talking more of reasons, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the role of religion, specifically Islam, in stoking extremism. What is your view on this? Has any of your research dealt with this?
So the research hasn't dealt with Islam compared to other motivations for extremism. What we've looked at is we've looked a little bit at what views within the various range of things which constitute someone's views of Islam correlate with support for violent extremist groups. And what we basically find is that, in Pakistan, which is the country we've done this in a couple of different surveys, there's a particular vision of what Islam means, which is associated with support for militant groups.